Hi, everyone. My name is Rohan. I'm one of the coaches this week, and I'll be giving the first topic lecture this week, which is on energy, environment, and technology. What's this list? Okay, yeah. Let's get started. Okay, so environment and energy is a pretty common topic area that you'll see. Not as much as technology is less popular in rounds, but environment and energy. I made a little list of the last year where we've seen these questions. In MBA and Harvard, these weren't specifically like an entire round by its own, but a lot of questions were featured in these specific rounds. And in at NSDA at nationals, the environmental round is in both USX and IX. So, with that being said, does anyone want to tell me what the main causes of climate change are? Maybe like you guys can put it in the chat. Capitalism. Okay, Sahas. Zoom meetings. Okay, I like that. Yeah, so these are pretty good answers. I kind of broke it down into five main parts, which are burning fossil fuels, deforestation, transportation, agriculture, and waste management. And it looks like you guys hit every single one of those. So that's good. Okay. So the biggest problem with these is that, or well, I guess these are the problems that caused the climate crisis. And so it really just comes down to solving these problems, right? Um, a lot of these release green. I don't even know the structure of my own lecture. Okay, let's go back. Greenhouse gases. Okay, there's three main greenhouse gases that are produced, which is carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. And so each of these come in different causes of the climate crisis. So, for example, fossil fuels are all three of those. Deforestation primarily allows for carbon dioxide to continue sitting in our environment. Transportation releases methane and nitrous oxide, so things like that, right? In extemp, you want to be very specific with the gases that you're going to talk about, and you want to make sure that the gases you're talking about, you're being very accurate about them because it's very easy to mix these up, and that's something you want to try and avoid. Okay, so this is where I was going to talk about the solutions. Okay, so the first part is transitioning to clean energy and replacing fossil fuels, right? So we can, clean energy is mainly, wind, solar, hydropower. Those are the main types and popular types of clean energy. We also need to invest in energy storage. And more recently, we've been seeing a push from not only lobbyists in the United States, but across the entire world to start putting onshore as well as offshore wind farms. In terms of fixing transportation, so electric vehicles have often been talked about as the future of vehicles itself and the vehicle industry. And even if it's not powered by electricity, working on low carbon fuels. So there are a few cars that exist that do run on biocarbon and even biomass. And then we need to stop deforestation. And one solution that has been brought up a lot of times in the United States is investing in carbon capture technology. But unfortunately, it's not that simple, okay? A lot of these are, things that haven't been talked about not only recently, but they've been talked about for decades, especially in the US government. Unfortunately, we haven't seen a lot of progress on that. So, the first part is transitioning to clean energy. So, unfortunately, our infrastructure is very, very heavily based on fossil fuels. That's heating grids, factories, power plants. Because of that, replacing it isn't going to be an easy process. And so, while we might build new factories or build new wind farms or build areas that do have solar panels, it's going to take time to not only build those, but also replace the current part of our infrastructure that does rely on fossil fuels. And since our infrastructure has been built up over the last few decades, and moreover over the last century or so, replacing all of this just takes a ridiculous amount of time that unfortunately we don't have. The second and probably more important reason is economic challenges. Okay. So over the long run, solar power, wind power, and those kinds of things actually are going to save us more money. But upfront costs are the reason why we won't see this happening anytime soon. Because unfortunately, our government isn't really concerned about what happens, 30, 40 years in the future. Our government's concerned about what happens in the next few years, especially for a lot of senators, representatives, even the president, right? Their terms only last, 6 years, 2 years, 4 years, right? So because of that, they only focus on what's going to happen now. And so a lot of times we don't see laws being passed on clean energy, specifically because of their costs and because of the refusal of politicians to be willing to spend so much money on clean energy. And then it'll also affect jobs, right? So 1.7 million jobs in the US and 32 million worldwide are directly employed by the burning or some sort of connection directly to fossil fuels. Because of that, replacing fossil fuels with clean energy is difficult. We can't exactly transition all of these jobs to clean energy, especially because sometimes clean energy doesn't even need a job, right? Burning fossil fuels is something that, can be done by a person, but you don't really need someone to collect solar power or to collect wind power. And yes, there are jobs related to it, but the number of jobs related to clean energy is nowhere near the number of jobs that, in the eyes of politicians, are available through fossil fuels. But with that being said, there still has been some success over the last few years. We've seen that because of technological breakthroughs in the US, solar and wind power have become cheaper, which means that it's likely that in the future, we're probably going to see more investments directly into clean energy. And 80% of new power in the last few years has actually been completely renewable or somewhat renewable. So all of this basically, the takeaway is that even though climate change is happening, there are solutions that are in place. But when it comes to transitioning to clean energy, it'll probably happen. But unfortunately, it's going to take time, and we're not sure if we really have that time to take that time and wait for the technology to become cheaper so that we can finally implement it. Within energy, there's five main types of energy that I'm going to talk about. The first two are solar energy and wind energy. Solar obviously comes from the sun, and so um, through that, we basically there's solar panels, right? They convert sunlight to electricity, and so the pros of that is that they're incredibly abundant, and they're the easiest to install, the easiest to set up, right? You can set them up on your homes, you can set them up in schools, buildings, wherever. They're also the cheapest right now compared to anything else. The problem is that they're intermittent, right? So it's only when the sun is there, but if it's raining at nighttime, the solar panels aren't exactly going to work because there's no sun. So it really depends on your geographic location, the time of the year, and the weather, of course. Um, the second is wind. So there are turbines that can be set up and wind farms. So there's been a lot of discussion about offshore wind farms. But the ways these work is through kinetic energy being directly from the winds being directly translated to electric energy. And once again, these are very clean, very cheap. But there are a few problems with them. The first is actually called NIMBY, and what that means, it's also known as NIMBYism, and what that means is not in my backyard. So unfortunately, people actually do have problems with the very sight of turbines themselves, and they don't want turbines that, like, basically they don't want them because they look ugly, right? So a lot of times you're actually going to see that people actually in polls and things like that vote against wind turbines and wind farms because they don't like their mechanical look and the way they are set up. The second reason is because they're heavily selective on location. So this really depends on whether a place is windy or not, and that wind itself is also intermittent. So it really depends on, where you set those up so that you're able to maximize the amount of energy that you can get from the wind. Now, there's been some research into offshore wind farms, which is basically wind farms that are built and located in the sea and are connected to electrical grids back on land. But the problem with those is that those are actually incredibly expensive to really drill into the ocean floor, set those up, collect the wind, and then set up all of the electrical lines that can directly connect back to grids. Unfortunately, that's just a lot to set up, and it's often quite expensive, which is why we constantly see that there is a lot of pushback against offshore and even onshore wind farms. Okay, so these types of energy, you might not see them too often in extemp in general, compared to you're probably going to see a lot of questions on offshore wind farms. Those are going to be very popular in extemp questions. For those of you who don't know what evergreens are, those are basically questions that aren't really based on current events. They're kind of just questions that consistently pop up because it's an ongoing event, right? So, for example, offshore wind farms is an example of a evergreen, and those are the types of questions that you will see consistently. Those are the ones that probably competitors before I started competing saw, and those are the ones that you guys might see even after I graduate or other people in the future graduate. I wouldn't be surprised if they still exist as questions, 3, 4, 5 years from now. But hydropower, biomass, and geothermal, I haven't really seen a lot of those. I know I've seen questions on hydropower, which is generated from kinetic energy that comes from the flowing or falling water. These are set up through dams or river systems, which means that it's very easy to set them up, right? There's a lot of water sources in the US, not only the oceans, but several rivers throughout the US and lakes that we can set them up at. The problem is that they often disrupt ecosystems because of the mechanical building of dams. Biomass also exists. It's organic material that's converted into energy. This is actually a lot of companies are exploring using this as vehicle fuel, and even using them in other areas. But unfortunately, biomass coming from organic material means things like wood, which you'd have to cut down in forests to get that wood. And then geothermal energy, which is a little bit more rare, but it's just based off the heat that comes from the Earth's surface. It's always going to exist because the Earth's surface is always hot. But the cons are that you're going to have to expend a lot on high drilling. Or sorry, on drilling. Okay. Now the next part is fixing transportation. So, when it comes to transportation, basically the biggest issue is that the power grid cannot support all of America being electric. That's kind of why electric vehicles haven't been, been so popularized as they are, is because our electrical grid, if suddenly tomorrow, for example, everyone converted to having an electric vehicle, our power grid would shut down. Because our power grid is split into three main parts, which is the eastern side, the western side, and for some reason, Texas decided to be special, so they have their own power grid. And so, as a result of that, we see that each of these power grids are not only separate, but they're also outdated. These have been built 25, 30 years ago. Some of them haven't even been touched in recent years. And there's a lot of issues with these power grids where we often see outages that affect, if not thousands, often hundreds of thousands of customers at a time sometimes. Um, and also we see that rural towns simply don't have electric vehicle charging stations. So it might be popular in more suburban places. So for example, Orlando, New York, San Francisco, those kinds of places often have electric vehicle charging stations. But for those places that are located on the countryside and things like that, they don't really have the type of charging stations that are necessary. And to some extent, you can set them up in their home, but also they lack the power grid themselves there to actually support electric vehicles. The second reason why electric vehicles aren't very popular yet is because of their cost. They're usually five to $10,000 more than typical cars that run off of fossil fuels and gas. And so because of that, it just financially it's a burden to buy electric vehicles for the majority of American consumers. Now, this gap has been closing in recent years. We've seen that it used to be 10, 15, even $20,000 more to buy an electric vehicle compared to the average car that runs on gas. In more recent years, especially in 2024 and 2025, this gap has been closed to $5,000. There used to be a few companies that were specialized specifically on manufacturing electric vehicles. Now we're seeing that a lot of mainstream car companies like Toyota, Ford, etc., they're actually manufacturing electric vehicles and even turning some of their main popular models directly into electric vehicles. Okay. Now, for those of you who might know about the $7,500 discount, during the Biden administration, there was a 7.5 thousand, yeah, $7,500 discount offered to anyone who buys an electric vehicle that directly goes and rebates that cost. Unfortunately, because of the passing of the Big Beautiful Bill, this $7,500 discount is actually going to be removed by September 30th of 2025. And so that actually pushes a lot of American consumers away from buying an electric vehicle, especially if an electric vehicle costs somewhere between 30 to 50 grand. That's, a significant chunk. That's as much as 20%, 25% of the cost suddenly just going back up because you don't get that $7,500 anymore. And that's actually one of the reasons why Elon Musk and Donald Trump had their major feud because we're ending that discount so soon. The final reason is because of battery materials. So, electric vehicles run off an electric battery, right? And so you need minerals for that. So, for example, lithium, zinc, and those kinds of things are expensive to mine. They're also directly damaging because in order to mine that, you need to deforest or you need to go to places and disrupt the ecosystem there in order to actually mine the very minerals that are necessary for electric vehicle batteries. Aside from that, we also see political division. So some states are more based on coal, on gas and oil. So those are typically the ones that will be against the adoption of electric vehicles, whereas other states are more likely to support electric vehicles, especially technology-based sector states. And then different administrations. We saw the Biden administration was very, very hopeful in pushing electric vehicles. They spent hundreds of millions of dollars supporting electric vehicle companies. And then the Trump administration just passed a big, beautiful bill, which ends the $7,500 discount for electric vehicles. So as we can see, there's a lot of political division that unfortunately just leads to politicians arguing and a lack of progress on fixing our transportation sector. Oh, and also Biden was working towards pushing for all school buses and buses, public buses in general, to be electric. Okay, so deforestation is also one of the biggest reasons why our climate is being affected the way it is. In the last 200 years, we've seen that our temperature has risen about 2 degrees Fahrenheit, which might not sound like a lot, but it actually is significantly more growth than we've seen in the last 10,000 years. And so deforestation happens because of, once again, economic incentives, right? So when forests are cleared, it benefits many industries. It benefits the logging industry, mining industry, agriculture. Our population simply is growing, right? So as a result of that, there needs to be homes developed, neighborhoods developed, even cities and towns need more space to build all sorts of things, whether it's shopping centers or just things that will serve a general population. And so that kind of ties back to the global demand, right? So we have a general, we need wood, right, in our lives. It's a general thing. We need minerals that support so many different industries, and because of the population growing, deforestation is always going to continue. The other thing is that we have tried to enforce laws against deforestation, right? So putting certain quotas on how much can be deforested, putting laws against illegal logging. But unfortunately, a lot of the time we see that nobody actually enforces these laws. We've seen in remote areas like in Indonesia, in the Amazon basin, that deforestation actually, even though there's laws against it, it still happens anyways because no one can effectively regulate these remote areas. And sometimes companies will even pay off politicians and even police forces to just turn a blind eye to these. Okay, now the Trump administration specifically has taken a lot of action to pretty much just ruin our environment. And I'm sorry, but that's just the fact. And you can even like search this up, but this is actually really funny. A kid there was like a time when the press secretary had like an interview of children, and so one kid like asked, and you might have seen this on Instagram, one kid like asked, what is Trump doing about climate change? And she ended up just saying that, oh, we need to have the strongest energy sector possible instead of talking about what's actually going to be done about climate change. But yeah, that pretty much just sums up the Trump administration. So first, they withdrew from the Paris Agreement, which basically Trump left actually in his first administration. Biden joined again, and then he left again. And then secondly, the Trump administration refuses to work with the United Nations on climate change. Let me see if I cover that in a separate slide. Do I? No. Okay. But actually the United Nations, wait. No. Okay. Yes. The United Nations has a lot of goals. So, for example, they have the Conference of the Parties. They have several sustainable goals that they work on, but unfortunately, there's no enforcement mechanism at all. So we've seen that specifically, a lot of times countries will come together, they'll make a plan. They want to, be carbon free by 2050. They want to bring a certain industry down that relies heavily on fossil fuels. They want to make this much percent of energy being produced clean energy. But then that never happens in the majority of countries. And the reason behind that is because there's no enforcement mechanism. The UN can't really do anything about countries not doing that. And it's not only one or two countries doing that, it's the majority of countries that don't do that. So even before the Trump administration, when the US was under the Biden administration or under the Obama administration, we saw that the US often wouldn't match these goals. And it wasn't just the US, several other major countries, the UK, France, almost every country in Europe, in Asia, they would just not follow these because of economic incentives, politicians arguing, things like that, that just basically ended up rendering the UN ineffective on climate change. And so because of that, we've also seen that more recently, Trump just isn't working with the United Nations on them. He's also deregulating, which means that basically he's allowing for more places to have drilling happening. He's stripping certain parts of the Clean Air Act. He actually last month, or maybe it was this month, but recently, well, I guess either June or July, he actually gave permission to 90 different companies to basically break the Clean Air Act and do whatever they want. And so that kind of just shows that he's very focused on energy growth. So, and there's kind of an explanation behind this. So, we saw that gas prices rose pretty effectively during the COVID-19 pandemic, which didn't just happen in the US, it happened across the world. But obviously, the entire US was very frustrated about that. And so the Trump administration I guess when they were, or before Trump, the Trump administration, when Trump was running for president, he actually honed a lot on this about having a separate national oil reserve and having very specific rules on how much energy the US should have so that the US is energy dominant. And so something like that doesn't happen again. And so as a result, he's been pushing for more drilling to occur. He's also fired a lot of people from the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Department of Energy has their secretary as Chris Wright, who is formerly the CEO of Liberty Energy. Now, this is relevant because Liberty Energy is a drilling company, and they also donated well over $1 million to Trump when he was running for president. So it wasn't Chris Wright who donated, but it was Liberty Energy who donated it through a PAC that ultimately found its way to Trump when he was running, and it found its way to his campaign. And so after that, Trump put Chris Wright into power as the Secretary of the Department of Energy, which should give you an idea of kind of the direction that the Trump administration is going with energy. Okay. Common political issues. So the Green New Deal. So the Green New Deal was passed a few years ago. It was heavily touted by AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. So the Green New Deal is something that's consistently argued on. I didn't really have a lot prepped for this, but these are kind of just major issues. So there's also fracking. There's a big disagreement over whether fracking's effective. One thing that I do want to say is you're gonna draw this question if you ever like, or well, I'm not saying you're going to, but if you go to a tournament that does have an environment, okay. If you're going to go to a tournament that does have an environment round, you are going to see a question that's worded something like this. Do the benefits of fracking outweigh the harms? And the answer will always be a no. Okay. If I see you answering a yes, like the benefits do outweigh the harms, that's just sad. Same thing with nuclear energy, it's never going to work. And the reason behind that is because nuclear energy is too expensive. And even though there's a lot of debate over whether we should use it or not, it's also going to just lead to a proliferation of nuclear energy being used for the wrong things. Similarly, the extent of climate change. There is a lot of debate between Republicans and Democrats of how much climate change actually is real. You will see that a lot of times far-right Republicans will argue that climate change is not a real thing. Climate change isn't happening. They'll disagree with scientists and they'll claim that it's a scam made up. It is a real thing, and I'm sure many of you guys know that. Hopefully, otherwise there's no point in me doing this lecture. And so, for example, we've seen that because of the disagreement over the extent of climate change, there's also a disagreement of how much organizations like NOAA and the EPA should be funded. And so we've seen a lot of funding cuts specifically for disaster management, which is a very, very bad idea because as a result of climate change, storms are becoming more intensive. So, for example, I live in Florida. Hurricanes have become more intensive, more frequent in the last few years. Before, I guess, 2017 or 2018, there were very few hurricanes that damaged Florida pretty badly. Then last year, there were three separate hurricanes that came to Florida, and two of them caused my school to actually shut down. So we're seeing that climate change is leading to storms being significantly worse, and as a result, cutting the funding for that is a bad idea. More recently, we've seen that enforcement mechanisms towards, for example, deforestation or even just making progress towards carbon um, free activities is basically just not happening. So, for example, the recommended or the safe amount of carbon dioxide in our environment is 350 parts per million, which is just a measurement. And in 2017 or 2018, we crossed this threshold and we're at 406.2 parts per million, and I'm sure that number is significantly up since then. So that's just giving you an idea of the fact that we have a lack of enforcement mechanisms. Social inequities. So, often it's marginalized and poorer communities that have a greater exposure to the effects. We've seen that a lot of times power plants and coal factories, things like those, are set up next to poorer communities. And so as a result, it's those poorer communities that are being directly more affected by the climate change crisis itself. And similarly, that leads to environmental racism and, moreover, health inequities. So it's more likely that those who live in poorer areas are going to suffer from health effects of climate change. So they might be breathing in worse air, drinking water that's actually contaminated. Things like that are more likely to happen in areas that are less well off economically compared to areas that are better off economically. Oh, that wasn't bad. Does anyone have any questions? Um, I'll try to answer them, hopefully, maybe.
I had a question. So earlier you mentioned that the big beautiful bill got rid of that 7,000 something
Mhm.
discount on electric vehicles. Why was that? Like, why did they do that? Especially because, well, I mean, they were Elon Musk and Trump were friends, and then now they're not because of that. So like,
Yeah, so basically I think one of the reasons why is because it was introduced under the Inflation Reduction Act, which was passed I think in 2022. And so yeah, okay, because they're evil, sure. So one reason why is because A, Trump hates Biden. He wanted to remove what Biden did and basically render the Biden administration ineffective. Second, because he wanted to remove the spending. So electric vehicles have become significantly more popular. In 2023, the Model Y, which is produced by Tesla, actually was the most commonly sold electric, or just in general, the most commonly sold vehicle that year in the US. There were over 1 million vehicles sold, right? So it's I think that was 1 million vehicles across the entire globe. I'm not too sure on that, but basically the point is that they're being sold a lot, and as a result, it's a lot of money that the government's spending and giving as a credit to people who are buying those. So it also reduces a lot of the spending that the federal government is doing.
Yeah. So, what are like the best sources and like exam round if you get a climate change question? What are like your reliable sources you typically use for like background info or like main points to get citations?
Yeah, so I think this can be divided into a few like groups of sources. So the first is just in general think tanks. Okay. So think tanks are very great. So the Brookings Institution, the Center for American Progress, even like if you're in an international round, the Council on Foreign Relations is also great. So these just give a lot of analysis in general on climate change issues. But then second, I think turning to scientific authorities would be good. So you can see that in the International Panel for Climate Change. You can go to NASA's website and see what they've written. I wouldn't recommend going to the EPA anymore just because of changes that would have happened that remove a lot of what they say. I think NOAA would still be a little bit trustworthy. And then there's also what's it called? The World Meteorological Organization. That's also a very good source. And then there is one source that yeah, Manga Bay is very good. Scientific journals. So there's a lot of them, especially Nature and Elsevier. They produce a lot of different scientific journals, and you can just read the abstract of the papers that were written. And then there is one group, I forget what they're called, but they're a UK-based nonprofit for environmental issues. You can search them up. I'm not too sure. Yeah, Melinda.
You mentioned earlier about like nuclear energy not being possible. What if you get questions about like, oh, should the US invest more or like prioritize nuclear energy? Should you always say no then?
I mean, that's just my opinion. I feel like I have the prep for that somewhere. Like I know I answered that question specifically, which is why I said that. Give me a second, maybe I can find exactly what I said. Um But yeah, so a lot of times in general, like, and for those of you who are in lower labs, like or not lower, but if you're in the beginner or intermediate lab, we'll talk a little bit more about should questions. But um, a lot of times it's just easier to answer no than yes because there's so many different reasons why you should like why something might not work, whereas you have to find the specific reasons why something will work. Okay, this is why I said it. So I said that first, nuclear energy is too expensive. And that is true. I got criticized by my judge for not explaining why it's too expensive, like what makes it too expensive. But it is pretty expensive. And then second, it takes too much time. This is also true, just in general, enriching for nuclear energy takes over 10 years. Weapon proliferation. So with nuclear energy comes nuclear weapons. And the United Nations has rules that are outlined that there's also the Non-Proliferation Treaty. which is also pretty much just dying, but that's okay. Basically, just if nuclear energy is introduced, then countries are going to try and use it um, for bad purposes in the future. But that's just my opinion. I mean, I'm sure you can do more research, but I would just recommend, like, in my opinion, not doing it.
Yeah, so I was wondering, I heard that there was, well, I heard you say that there is a push for like offshore wind farms, but then you also mentioned how people don't want it. So then why is there a push for it to be offshore if people, I was just like slightly confused.
Yeah, okay, sure. I can explain that a little better. So, okay. I would kind of imagine it, in my opinion, as like two different groups. So you have people who want people who want wind energy and people who don't want wind energy. Now, the reason why people don't want wind energy, there's a variety of reasons. NIMBYism is very popular, which is not in my backyard. They simply hate the look of it, right? And so it's being placed. So the people who are pushing for offshore wind farms are completely separate from the people who don't want wind farms at all, or who don't want to see turbines in their backyard, basically. So the people who are pushing for it argue that first, it's not even in sight because you're putting it in the ocean, so that solves the problem of that. But then the people who don't want to do offshore wind farms don't like it because it's too expensive, and that's because you have to drill into the ocean floor and place it. And then second, you also have to connect it to electrical power grids back on land. But those are two kind of separate issues. I'm sure like people who argue for NIMBYism probably also argue the same thing that they don't want to see wind turbines in the sea. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Um, we have 23 minutes left. That should be enough. Okay. So, technology is a little bit less popular. They are sometimes seen as rounds. So, these are a few examples of where they were a specific round, and then these are kind of like tournaments in the last year where they weren't a specific round, but a lot of their questions were seen in this round. So like for example, technology often becomes a social issue. So like Harvard quarters was social issues, but I think like 5 or 6 questions, and I think even the one that I drew was on technology. And it's also a USX round in NSD. I think it was semis this year at NSDA. I think actually, if you guys know who Andrew Zhang is, he answered a question on technology, like regulating cell phones in school. Um, but okay, yeah, for reference, what do you guys think of when you hear the word technology in an extemp context? AI, yeah, That's that's a big one. Crypto, okay, yes. Regulating Elon Musk, okay. Cybersecurity. Yeah, so these are some good answers. So there's 5 main things that I thought of, and you guys hit a few of them, which is artificial intelligence, of course, cybersecurity, data privacy, weapons and national security, excuse me, and healthcare. Okay, so understanding artificial intelligence. So, artificial intelligence is a type of deep learning that essentially enables an algorithm to teach itself how to do something based on data that's fed to it. So, there's 3 main types of AI, and then there's something called artificial general intelligence. But the 3 types of AI are generative AI, computer vision, and NLP and LLMs. So the first is generative AI. So if you guys ever see like AI generated images, or sometimes like if you scroll on Reels, you're gonna see videos of like people saying things that they never said. That's generative AI. And what that does is it basically creates something based on a prompt that you give it. Computer vision is more popular in terms of using it to try and identify certain things through a computer. So it's kind of like a computer acting as an eye. For example, computer vision is used in security cameras. If you ever upload like a picture of your homework to ChatGPT, that's what ChatGPT uses to read your homework. It's used in Face ID. Self-driving cars use it to kind of navigate. And then NLP and LLMs, which stands for natural language processing and large language machines. So, or large language models, sorry. So NLP is kind of just the study of words itself and how different words connect to each other. And so that's not very like task specific, which means that NLP is used for just in general understanding a language or a specific word. But then LLMs are used for specific tasks, right? So we can see that LLMs might be used as chatbots, as assistants. Sometimes they use them as insurance agents. ChatGPT is an example of an LLM that covers a lot of different fields. And then finally, there's AGI, which stands for Artificial General Intelligence, and that's kind of just a future version of AGI that's expected to be significant, or a future version of AI that's expected to be significantly more powerful than AI because it's able to do tasks while thinking instead of just relying on past data. Okay, so the main issues with AI, first off, is job replacement. So, in 2022 or 2023, during the Biden administration, Joe Biden introduced the AI Bill of Rights, which is basically a set of guidelines and laws on how AI will be regulated, how AI should be used, and how it'll affect jobs. And basically, what it stated was we won't use AI to replace jobs, we'll use it to work alongside and assist humans and benefit humans. And so he talked a lot about technical jobs, like, for example, insurance agents, people working in human resources, things like that. But he didn't mention, traditional skills like welders or things like that. He never talked about how AI machines and robots might replace that. So that's actually kind of an issue with the AI Bill of Rights. And then in general, it can replace pretty much any job you can think of, right? You guys might hear the meme, computer science majors are cooked, right? That's because AI is incredibly, incredibly good at coding. And so because it's so good at coding, it's basically able to do the job of a CS major. Okay, so then after that, you have bias, accuracy, and data. So AI is only as good as the data that you train it on. So for example, let's say I train an AI model for computer vision to identify whether an object is a dog or a cat, right? So I give it data and I give it maybe 1,000 images of a dog and 1,000 images of a cat. And so it learns from that, and then maybe I put a cat in front of it and it'll say that it's a cat. But then you can kind of troll with AI, right? So you can, instead of telling the AI that, okay, these are dogs and these are cats, you might mislabel them. And you might give it 1,000 images of a dog, but you might say, oh, this is a cat. And you might give it 1,000 images of a cat, but then tell it that it's a dog. And then when you give it a dog, it'll tell you that it's a cat because it was mislabeled. And so because of that, people will actually use the data in wrong ways to try and train AI to do wrong actions and activities. And then that's kind of where the bias in data comes, right? So, excuse me. A lot of times we'll see that data will be misaligned or biased in a way that benefits a certain population or a certain group of people. There's also an issue with data privacy. So a lot of times there's fears over whether when you use an artificial intelligence model, if it uses your data to retrain. And so a lot of times there's policies that need to be passed and rules specifically on whether artificial intelligence should be able to actually collect the data. And all the time there's congressional hearings on the type of data that major companies are collecting from people to try and train their AI models. And then similarly, I'll talk a little bit more in healthcare about AI bias, actually. But finally, we have environmental damage. So, artificial intelligence requires a lot of electricity. And then it requires a lot of energy because of that, and it requires water to cool it down. And so a lot of times we're seeing that a lot of energy and water is being wasted as a result of artificial intelligence factories. So there's a major supercenter being built in Texas right now to host a lot of artificial intelligence training. Google spent about $100 billion on a separate facility and warehouse to train AI models and host the hardware that's needed to train and operate artificial intelligence models. And there's a massive push from multi-billion-dollar companies and multi-trillion-dollar companies to make AI as accurate and powerful as possible. More recently, they've been spending hundreds of millions of dollars in paying some of the brightest AI research scientists to come in and help them with their AI models. Okay, so artificial intelligence, and this is where you're going to see a lot of questions, is through its influence. Artificial intelligence is powered by semiconductors, right? Which powers and stores the data sets that are necessary to train artificial intelligence, and it's critical to the computing power that's needed for AI. The more powerful semiconductors you have, the more you're going to be able to train these models, make them more accurate, give them the power they really need to succeed in their abilities. And so, one of the biggest semiconducting companies and the world's leader for manufacturing these semiconductor chips and things like that is the Taiwan Semiconducting Manufacturing Company, right, based out of Taiwan. And so that's why there's actually a lot of fight over Taiwan. And one of the big reasons why China wants to take over Taiwan because of their semiconductor industry. It makes up between 50 to 60% of Taiwan's GDP, and it employs a lot of people in Taiwan. Now, the reasoning is that if China is able to take over Taiwan, it'll have direct access to those manufacturing chips. And as a result, China will actually be able to control where those chips are being sold to around the world, right? So the TSMC is partnered with NVIDIA and a lot of US-based companies. The difference between NVIDIA, and I've kind of outlined it here, is that NVIDIA does the research and designs the chips, and then TSMC manufactures them and sells them to companies around the world. And so they have, without NVIDIA, you don't have any chips being manufactured. And that's why Nvidia's, such a huge growing company and why the company's ballooned in terms of their values because of how much AI chips are necessary today. But going back to the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, as a result of that, we see that often powerful countries are trying to place limits on them. So the United States is home to a lot of major tech companies, right? It's home to Google, it's home to Facebook, Apple, even Nvidia. It's home to all these major companies that have contracts with the TSMC. So since the TSMC makes a lot of its money from these US-based companies, the US is able to regulate the TSMC and actually try to place limits on how many chips they're able to sell to China. Now, eventually, it has to reach a certain limit because China, of course, will get upset if they are being limited on the amount of chips that they are able to access. So there's kind of a balance between how many chips are being sold to China and how many are being sold to the US and around the world. But essentially, whoever has control of those semiconductor manufacturing chips can lead the world in artificial intelligence through the computing power that's necessary and the ability to train these artificial intelligence models. And so over the next few years, we'll see that as more and more advanced chips are designed, artificial intelligence will continue to grow. So for example, in the last few years, we saw that the jump from GPT-3 to GPT-4, it was like several hundred times better. GPT-4 was several hundred times better than GPT-3. And we kind of starting to see an exponential growth within artificial intelligence to the point where it might actually, unless guidelines and regulations are put in place, it might actually devastate humanity. Okay, national security and weapons. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit more about the ethics of AI in defense as much as national security. What you really need to know, because this is kind of a separate lecture that Rowan will be giving tomorrow about defense, is basically our defense budget has also been growing rapidly. It was $800 billion in 2024. I believe that it's going to be over $1 trillion. And a lot of this money is spent on missiles, drones, and fighter jets. More importantly, the ethics of artificial intelligence in defense. So, artificial intelligence can actually be used in so many different ways in defense. One really interesting thing that some researchers are working on is actually artificial intelligence that is installed in the helmets of soldiers that are used. And what this actually does is it monitors their brain waves because being a soldier in a battlefield is actually very tiring. And so it monitors the brain waves and actually stimulates the brain in order to keep the person awake while they're in the battlefield. And it kind of acts as something that makes them more aware of their surroundings. Artificial intelligence is also seen in drones. So a lot of times in surveillance, we use computer vision in drones and even fighter jets to kind of identify things and identify targets. And currently in the war between Russia and Ukraine, artificial intelligence is being implemented in drones. And so that's kind of where the ethics of artificial intelligence come, right? Does artificial intelligence have the ability to make a decision as to whether to fire, a missile that might kill or injure people? Should artificial intelligence replace humans? Because if you think about it, right, instead of for example, in surveillance, it might be ethical to have artificial intelligence being placed in a fighter jet and operating a fighter jet like a robot instead of a human, because there's so many more risks when a human's flying a fighter jet. And also, artificial intelligence might be more powerful. You don't have to worry about, the human being killed, having to um, parachute out of the fighter jet. But then when it comes to decisions like should artificial intelligence, be shooting at people? Should it be dropping bombs? Making decisions on places to strike. That's where there's a lot of debate over the ethics of AI making those human-like decisions and machines having more power than they should. And so, the Department of Defense and several other countries around the world are working together to try and make a set of regulations on artificial intelligence in defense so that it's used in a responsible way without harming people in any sort of way that it shouldn't be used for. Okay, healthcare. So, one of the biggest things about healthcare, and if you watched Robert's speech earlier this year at NSDA, is telehealth. So, telehealth was introduced primarily during, it existed before, but it became very popular during the COVID-19 pandemic when patients couldn't visit their doctors and vice versa. So, telehealth is basically where the doctor and patient meet over Zoom or a similar platform and discuss. It things like checkups are made much more simple, and so that's kind of where technology can start to play into solving some of the issues in other sectors, right? So for example, people who live in rural areas, it's harder for them to access physicians or clinicians and even hospitals in general. And so telehealth for non-emergency cases can be used so that the doctor is able to at least communicate with the patient instead of people having to travel significantly. It's not like a one-size-fits-all solution. There's definitely a lot of issues with telehealth that need to be fixed, but it definitely is promising and showed its potential during the COVID-19 pandemic. Then second, digitalizing health records. So health records are crucial, right? They provide a lot of information about the patient. And so sometimes now, what people are doing is they're using artificial intelligence to analyze different health records from different periods of times, make predictions on possible diseases the person can get, possible, the prognosis of a disease, and things like that, faster than human doctors can actually do that. And then finally, bias from artificial intelligence models. So a lot of times AI models might be trained on data that primarily comes from one race or one gender, things like that. And so AI models might make decisions that are, bad in terms of their bias because its training data set biases, or sorry, its training data set is biased towards a certain population. So for example, right, if going back to the dogs and cats examples, if I give an artificial intelligence model like 100 images of a cat, right? But then like 10,000 images of a dog, it's actually going to learn a lot more about a dog than it's going to learn about a cat. And similarly, an AI model can actually just, predict everything as a dog, right? And then it has a pretty high accuracy because it's trained on a lot of dogs, compared to a cat's. And so not only does it know a lot more about dogs and it's able to be more accurate about dogs, but it also might make wrong decisions just because it's more likely to be accurate that it actually is a dog than a cat. And so because of that, artificial intelligence models being used in healthcare, there's issues with data privacy, whether people want to share confidential information like their health records to an AI model. And then second, the bias that it might have as a result of being trained on a certain population's data. Okay, so the Trump administration and technology. So in January or February of 2025, Donald Trump issued the executive order called Removing Barriers to American Leadership in Artificial Intelligence. What this means is basically he killed the AI Bill of Rights, and he made a set of laws and rules, or not laws, but I guess a set of action items for him to work with artificial intelligence companies and the government to work with artificial intelligence companies to boost AI in the US because Donald Trump's action basically comes down to America first. And if America can beat its primary competitor, which is China, in terms of artificial intelligence, then it holds significant power over the rest of the world. As a result of that, he's been making deals with companies like Amazon, Google, Apple, OpenAI, and has even been trying to push for healthcare data to be shared with these companies to revolutionize healthcare-based models. And then this isn't really on artificial intelligence, but the Department of Government Efficiency actually digitalized a lot of employee-based records and introduced a lot of technology into towards making the government more efficient. And then in July of 2025, Donald Trump pushed for the AI Action Plan, which had over 90 policy measures. And he's also putting a lot of controls on other countries and limiting their ability in terms of artificial intelligence in order for the US to succeed at artificial intelligence and technology in general. Yeah, that's pretty much all I have. Does anyone have any questions? Maybe? No?
Um,
Yeah.
I do have one question. I think it might have been I just like missed something you said or I didn't understand. But when you were talking about how lots of tech companies are based in the US and this allows us to regulate how many semiconductors China gets to purchase from Taiwan, I think I just missed the connection. Like how is that the companies regulating it or the US government?
Sure. So, I guess one way to imagine it is the U.S. regulates tech-based companies that are in the U.S. Or, yeah. So, for example, Google, Apple, those kinds of companies, even OpenAI, they're all regulated by U.S. laws. But because those companies operate in the US, the majority of the Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing companies' clients come from the US, which means that the US government now has power over Taiwan and these companies itself by connecting. It can basically cut the connection between the between these companies itself, and instead the US can be like, oh, we'll turn to other partners in the world to manufacture these semiconducting or the semiconductors for the US companies. Because of the US's leverage over not only the companies, but because also be over the semiconducting manufacturing company in Taiwan, it has the ability to tell Taiwan, if you don't stop selling these chips to China, then instead we'll force our companies to seek business in other countries in the world. Does that make sense?
Okay. Okay, I'm just gonna say it one more time so I make sure I have it right.
Yeah.
But like because US government okay, all the American tech companies are big customers of the Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing company.
Hmm.
So okay, they're important customers. Sorry, I'm like
Yeah.
figuring it out. They're important customers, and the U.S. government can regulate them to turn to other sources if Taiwan doesn't listen to um to them for their sales to China.
Exactly, yeah. And because
Okay, thank you.
Taiwan's industry is so heavily based off of the semiconducting company that they're forced, or their economy, yeah, is they're basically forced to listen to the US because of this. Does anyone else have any other questions? I think yeah, that is true, Ty. There is no other alternative. But it is a threat that the US is able to hold. They might reduce the amount of business being done. But Taiwan is the leading company in the world for semiconductor manufacturing.